Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, expecting a quick victory. Officials insisted Kyiv would fall within a day, and state media portrayed the operation as routine. But 3 years later, Russia controls only around 20% of Ukraine and has suffered close to 1 million casualties, more than the US lost in 20 years of the war on terror. The war that was supposed to last days has become a national disaster for Russia. Territorial gains reveal how misguided Russia's expectations were. The Institute for the Study of War reported that in 2022, Russia captured about 4,200 square kilometers of land, mostly in Donetsk, just 0.6% of Ukraine, barely larger than Rhode Island. In 2025, a Forbes analysis showed Russia gained only 68 square miles in an entire year. At that rate, experts estimated it would take Russia over 230 years to occupy the entire country. One study even suggested that total occupation would require nearly 100 million Russian casualties, almost the size of the country's entire population. These numbers expose the reality. Russia is not advancing with a clear strategy. It is grinding forward without a viable military plan, paying enormous human and economic costs for minimal territorial change. The illusion of Russian momentum disappears as soon as the data is examined. Russia's losses also reveal a severe demographic problem. Ukraine reports nearly 1 million Russian casualties, while conservative Western estimates still exceed 750,000. To put this into perspective, Russia lost only about 15,000 soldiers in its 10-year war in Afghanistan. In Ukraine, it has lost more than 60 times that number in only 3 years. Russia already faced a shrinking, aging population before the war, and now the shortage of young men has become even more critical. Beyond battlefield losses, nearly 1 million Russians have fled the country to avoid mobilization, removing even more working-age men from the economy and military pool. Russia is slowly running out of people to sustain the war, let alone achieve its goals. The roots of this disaster go back to the invasion's planning. Russian leadership expected Ukraine to collapse instantly. Soldiers were told to prepare for light resistance, and some units reportedly carried parade uniforms for the victory march into Kyiv. Logistics were prepared for a short campaign, not a prolonged conflict. When Ukraine resisted, the entire invasion plan fell apart. Russia failed to secure air superiority, lost hundreds of tanks to drones and anti-tank teams, and watched elite units take devastating early losses. These setbacks forced the Kremlin to replace professional soldiers with poorly trained conscripts, convicts, and foreign recruits. Analysts later described Russia's planning as one of the greatest intelligence failures of the 21st century. Russia's logistical failures became clear in the first weeks of the invasion. The entire war plan relied on a rapid collapse of Ukrainian defenses, but once that assumption proved false, Russia had no backup strategy. Supply lines broke down almost immediately. Vehicles ran out of fuel, ammunition was delayed, and communication between units was chaotic. Russia's military was built for short, decisive operations, not a long, grinding war. The failed assault on Hostomel Airport exposed these weaknesses early on. Russia expected to capture the airfield and fly in troops to encircle Kyiv, but Ukraine's defense destroyed that plan within hours. When the assault collapsed, Russia failed to adapt. Commanders continued pushing forward without revising their tactics, resulting in massive losses of tanks, armored vehicles, and elite airborne units. As the war shifted into a prolonged conflict, Russia's propaganda machine portrayed minor gains as major victories. State media celebrated advances of only a few kilometers. But behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating. Russia was losing experienced soldiers faster than it could replace them, and the army began relying heavily on conscription, prison recruits, and private military groups. At the same time, Russia's economy started to buckle under the pressure of sanctions and war spending. On paper, Russia remained one of the world's largest economies, but many industries were collapsing from within. Sanctions crippled high-tech sectors, restricted access to critical components, and isolated Russia from global markets. International investment dried up, and the ruble became increasingly unstable. Russia's transition into a war economy made things even worse. Analysts estimate that nearly 40% of the government's budget now goes to the military, a level impossible to maintain long-term. A large portion of this spending is hidden under secret projects, reflecting fear, secrecy, and growing pressure on the Kremlin to conceal the true cost of the war. Meanwhile, Russia's most important source of income, oil and gas, began to weaken. Europe reduced its reliance on Russian energy by more than 30%, and Russia was forced to sell oil to China and India at steep discounts. This left the government increasingly dependent on a shrinking workforce and fewer functioning industries, pushing the economy toward long-term decline. With its military struggling and its economy deteriorating, Russia faces a growing crisis on multiple fronts. Yet the leadership continues on the same course, unable to retreat politically and unable to win militarily. The war has become Russia's new status quo, but it is a status quo built on exhaustion, not strength. Russia's military strength, long believed to be the world's second most powerful, has been exposed as deeply overstated. Before the invasion, analysts pointed to Russia's massive tank fleets, large air force, and millions of active and reserve personnel. But on the battlefield, this supposed power fell apart. The invasion revealed outdated equipment, poor training, and a military culture built on illusion rather than capability. One of the earliest signs was the disastrous situation at Hostomel Airport. Russia dropped elite paratroopers expecting an easy victory, but instead they were pinned down and suffered heavy losses. With no support arriving in time, the operation collapsed. Russia's inability to adapt highlighted rigid command structures and poor communication. Long armored columns stalled on roads, running out of fuel and becoming easy targets for Ukrainian drones and anti-tank teams. Further investigations showed alarming levels of corruption inside Russia's military. Advanced tanks like the T-90M were found with reactive armor filled with sand or cement instead of explosives. Fighter pilots relied on taped-on commercial GPS units because their navigation systems malfunctioned. Supposed next-generation weapons existed in tiny numbers or were kept out of combat to avoid embarrassment if destroyed. Russia's military doctrine also contributed to these failures. Built largely on Soviet-era thinking, it focused on defending against NATO, not launching large-scale offensive operations. Its centralized command slowed decision-making, making quick adaptation nearly impossible. In contrast, Ukraine used flexible tactics, modern drones, and Western intelligence to outmaneuver larger Russian forces. As professional soldiers were lost, Russia turned to conscripts, convicts, and fighters from remote regions. This shift resulted in lower quality units and higher casualties. Minority populations were disproportionately affected, deepening internal tensions. The strain on manpower grew severe as Russia struggled to field effective troops. These systemic issues, corruption, outdated doctrine, rigid leadership, and failing equipment, shaped the course of the war. Russia expected a rapid victory, but instead found itself in a prolonged conflict. It was never prepared to fight. Every month of fighting exposes deeper weaknesses in Russia's military and raises the long-term cost of its miscalculations. Russia's political system, built around Vladimir Putin, is now facing consequences far beyond the battlefield. The regime depends heavily on loyalty, secrecy, and controlled information. This environment prevents honest assessments and leads to decisions based on propaganda rather than reality. Former Kremlin advisors have admitted that even senior officials underestimated how obsessed Putin had become with Ukraine and how deeply the government had decayed from within. This flawed decision-making structure turned the Russian military into a victim of its own system. Corruption thrived because no one wanted to report failures. Training exercises were staged for show instead of preparing troops for real combat. Equipment listed as combat-ready was often barely functional. These systemic problems created the perfect conditions for disaster once the war demanded adaptability and modern tactics. As losses mounted, Russia's internal stability began to weaken. Economic strain, combined with manpower shortages, has created severe pressure on the country's long-term future. Analysts warn that Russia could face several stages of internal fragmentation if the war continues. Economic breakdown would come first, as constant military spending drains resources and infrastructure falls further into disrepair. Political fragmentation could follow, with regional leaders asserting greater autonomy as Moscow's influence weakens. Military cohesion is also at risk. As professional forces are depleted, units increasingly rely on poorly trained recruits, leading to falling morale and higher desertion rates. Equipment shortages become more pronounced, and the ability to coordinate operations diminishes. In an extreme scenario, if the central government loses authority, Russia could fracture into multiple regions, a process similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but potentially far more chaotic due to nuclear weapons. And modern geopolitical tensions. Internationally, the war has backfired completely. Instead of weakening NATO, Russia has revitalized the alliance. Finland and Sweden joined, doubling NATO's border with Russia. European countries have increased defense spending, modernized their forces, and strengthened cooperation. Rather than isolating Ukraine, Russia has isolated itself, becoming increasingly dependent on China for economic survival. After 3 years of war, Russia controls only a fraction of Ukrainian territory while suffering devastating casualties, economic decline, and global isolation. The conflict designed to restore Russia's power has instead exposed its vulnerabilities. The Kremlin now faces a crisis with no good options. It cannot win decisively, cannot withdraw without political collapse, and cannot negotiate a peace that supports its narrative. The longer the war continues, the more severe the consequences will be for Russia's future. What was expected to be a quick victory has turned into a strategic disaster, one that may shape the fate of the Russian Federation for decades.